So when Russia attacked Ukraine, everyone expected the war to be over within days. And here we are a year into the war. Russia is struggling to gain any further ground. If anything, it's losing ground it had previously gained.
But this is a defining moment, and this is the cost we are willing to pay, because freedom is priceless, honorable members.
In all of this, another surprising thing has happened. Most of the world has come together in support of Ukraine and has condemned Russia for its actions. At the beginning of this war, the West imposed a bunch of sanctions on Russia. The idea was simple. Worst case scenario, it slows down Russia's progress in the war. And best case scenario, it starts an uprising within the country which takes down Putin and everyone lives happily after. In this video, we look at those economic sanctions and what impact they've had on the war and on the Russian economy. So let's get started. The year is 1991, and after years of oppression and protesting, Soviet Union finally collapses. And as the name suggests, Soviet Union is a union of multiple countries coming together. And as Soviet Union falls apart, all the countries go back to being independent countries. And that's exactly what happens with Ukraine and Russia. Now, Russia, being one of the biggest and the most powerful countries in the region, continued dominating the geopolitics in the region. For many years after the Soviet Union's collapse, both Ukraine and Russia have had a very friendly relationship. This friendly relationship was partially because Russia, as I said, was a dominant power, and partially because Russia was sponsoring and making sure that certain pro-Russia presidents were elected in Ukraine. As all of this is happening, there's this one man by the name of Putin who starts to rise to power in Russia. And over the years, he has consolidated all the power to himself, and in the process killed any opposition that existed within Russia. Now let's move forward to 2013, and in the last decade or so, the public opinion in Ukraine has shifted more towards creating better relationships with the West, the NATO, and the European Union. I mean, it makes sense. The European Union has been progressing at a faster rate than Russia, which again is a dictatorship at this point under the rule of Putin.
Мы не просто близкие соседи. Мы фактически, как я уже много раз говорил, один народ.
Putin for decades has expressed that Ukraine is supposed to be part of Russia. Back when he was not a lunatic, the world just assumed he's making a metaphorical statement, just a thing you say, a symbolic gesture. Now let's move one more year into the future, that is 2014. As the Ukrainian people want to move closer to the European Union, the West, and the NATO, they have a president in power by the name of Viktor Yanukovych, who you may have guessed is pro-Putin and Russia. When in 2014 the president signed a treaty with Russia which brought them closer to Russia instead of Europe, there were massive protests throughout the country. The situation got so bad that Viktor had to leave the country in the middle of the night.
Video has emerged which appears to show President Yanukovych's entourage fleeing from his luxurious mansion outside Kiev.
Realizing that he had lost all control of Ukraine, Putin launched a war on the southernmost part of Ukraine by the name of Crimea.
Russian troops moving swiftly to take control of military bases in Crimea.
And at the same time, he started funding and sponsoring terrorist activities or separatist movements in Donbass and Donetsk regions of Ukraine. And since then, about 14,000 people have lost their lives in this proxy war that was started by Putin. But Putin wasn't done yet. In February of 2022, Putin launched another war, this time with the goal of taking over the entire country of Ukraine. The success of his plan relied on two strategies. The first strategy relied on the fact that the Russian military is a lot more advanced and stronger than Ukraine. The idea was that within days, the Ukrainians would run out of either manpower or ammunition to fight this war. The second part of the strategy relied on the idea that Ukraine would be isolated soon enough. No one would back them up because of the Russian nuclear arsenal. And as we all know, that is not how it has turned out. From the very beginning, the Russian army has made a lot of strategic errors. At the same time, the Ukrainians have fought very smart and hard. Numerous people from all across the globe have flown into Ukraine in order to support them and fight for Ukraine, which is the opposite of what Putin had hoped for. And as far as the isolation of Ukraine is concerned, it's turned out to be the opposite. The world has come together in support of Ukraine. About 114 countries condemned Russia's action. And out of that, about 39 different countries have imposed economic sanctions on Russia. What are sanctions, you may ask? Sanctions are penalties imposed by one country on another. to stop them from acting aggressively or breaking the international law. They are some of the toughest actions a country can take without going to war. Imposing sanctions on a country is not as expensive as going to war with a country. However, there are costs associated which impact both the country being targeted and the country that is targeting. Typically, imposing sanctions will lead to inflation and a mild recession within both the countries. When the cost of things goes up, inflation, people in a democracy are not happy, and that makes it a very fine balancing act that a politician or the policymakers have to do.
Inflation soared to its highest level in over a decade in April.
The biggest month-over-month increase in September, get this, 2008.
The sharp increase in inflation.
As part of the sanctions, Russian Reserve Bank's assets worth $300 billion were frozen. Meanwhile, access to the Western banks and the money transferring network has been cut. At the same time, West has stopped buying certain commodities from Russia in the hopes of weakening Russian economy. Russian oil was one such commodity that Europe had to find alternatives to. The predictions by the Western media that these economic sanctions would decimate Russian economy have been proven wrong. Overall, the Russian economy is weaker and is going through a mild recession. But the idea that this whole thing would lead to Putin being taken down is far from reality. All of this is not a surprise to the analysts. From the get-go, the Western policymakers had to hold their punches by allowing major exceptions to the Russian exports, like oil, gas, coal, fertilizers, uranium, wheat, just to name a few. Banning these exports would have impacted the European countries and the people living in it, which means the policymakers would no longer be able to enjoy the support they currently enjoy from their own voters.
And on to a story that's a crude awakening for the West. India and China have unleashed their hunger for Russian oil, sending import levels skyrocketing to unprecedented levels.
As Europe has shifted away from Russian oil, China and India and some other countries have stepped up their imports. In all of this, India's point of view has been quite straightforward. As a nation, they condemned the act of war that Russia is committing. But as a third world country which relies on importing a whole bunch of oil because they don't produce as much as they consume, it makes complete sense that they buy oil when it's cheap and pass those benefits on to the voters and the general public within the country. Meanwhile, China has also increased its exports into Russia, making sure Russia has access to all the things they couldn't access through the West. As the war continues, Russia has made partnerships and strategic connections with other countries throughout the world.
Hello and welcome. The Chinese President Xi Jinping has arrived in Moscow for his first visit since Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year.
In the long term, these sanctions will have an impact on Russia. And for the ordinary Russian, this would mean a lack of goods and services in stores and whatnot. Things that they were used to before the war started just wouldn't be there anymore. This economic stagnation is unlikely to end Putin's regime. It's just not going to happen. This economic stagnation will definitely lead to more political agitation and more political opposition to Putin, but at the same time, there'll be more suppression, more repression that's done by Putin's regime. These economic sanctions, accompanied with the West providing Ukraine with the weapons they need and the military training, that is what has been effective. One of these things on their own perhaps won't be as effective, but all these things combined may just lead to Ukraine winning this war. The big question that remains is, for how long would West stick together? And to see how this war ends, we'll just have to wait it out and see how it goes. That's it for this video. I'll see you in a week or two's time from now.